As we preach through all these Jesus stories, I do hope you see that Jesus seemed to believe that nothing happened to him by accident. His life was a story that God was telling, and he was using all creation to do so. He believed that nothing happened to him by accident, and nothing happens to you by accident. Actually, Scripture is clear that you are a story that God is telling with Jesus. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made through him, including you and your story, and without him was not anything made that was made, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, full of grace and truth. And we have beheld his glory, and then we nailed him to a tree in the garden because we didn't like the story. But now I'm getting ahead of myself. Just let me point out that Jesus seemed to believe that we are like living in a parable. That means that all creation is a sign, a metaphor. So why do we speak in metaphors? Well, if I say a thought went over your head, I'm using a physical picture to describe a spiritual reality. I think this may be a bad use of the term, but we often refer to the physical reality as the literal meaning, and the idea as the metaphor. We tend to think the physical is more real than the spiritual, but Jesus seems to think the spiritual is more real, more solid, more permanent, more firm than this entire world. Jesus seemed to think that this whole world was the metaphor. And what it meant was truly solid and eternal. Like gold buried in some field. Like a pearl that you might find in an oyster buried in the mud. Like the meaning hidden in each and every day. And so, if you don't pay attention, you could live your life never having lived your life. It would be like just one empty calendar day after another and after another and after another. But if you sought first his kingdom and his righteousness, you could live your life eternally, having each day like filled with meaning. Eternal life. Well, Jesus seemed to think that everything is a metaphor. So you're living in a parable, and the days of your life form a story, and God writes that story, and you are a character in your own story. God writes your story. And everybody thinks, oh, that's such a nice thought. We think that means that God gives us a list of instructions on how to write a good story. If we take that knowledge of the good and use it to write our story, we say with false humility, well, God wrote the story. And if we screw up, we say, oh, if only I had let God write my story. But you see, something utterly amazing and fascinating happens in Matthew 16, verses 5 through 12. At first, it seems like a contradiction, but one day I think we'll see, one eternal day, I think we'll see that, it's not. The disciples, this is the fascinating thing that happens. The disciples screw up. They forgot the bread. On like so many levels, they forgot the bread. They think, if only I had remembered the bread. Like you think, if only I had remembered the car keys and wouldn't have missed that appointment. If only I would have looked in the rearview mirror as I backed up and not backed up over my own child. If only. See, they screwed up. And Jesus acts as if God had never stopped writing the story. In fact, once Jesus enters the picture, he gives new meaning to all their empty time spent worrying about bread and turns that fact into the gospel of Matthew that we just read today, 2,000 years later on the other side of the world. That's amazing. He redeems their time. They thought, if only, and Jesus acts as if only, is actually not. As if there is no if only. As if, in the words of Paul, God accomplishes all things according to the counsel of his will. In other words, God does all things. So anything that God doesn't do isn't actually done. 2 Corinthians 2:13, Paul writes that he missed an open door because he was worried about Timothy. Worry is sin. He screwed up, but the next sentence he writes is, thanks be to God who always leads us in triumph. God never stopped writing the story, as if where sin increased, grace just abounded all the more. And that's the story. Adam and Eve screwed up. Can you think of a bigger screw up than that? But did God stop writing the story? We sinners, oh gosh, we all screwed up. We crucified Christ on a tree in a garden. Did God ever stop writing the story? No, that is the story from the foundation of the world, the gospel of Jesus the Christ. I'm just pointing out that, well, I'm probably not just pointing out, but I want you to get this, that Jesus seemed to think we're living in a parable. And so number one, all creation is a metaphor. Number two, God writes the story. Number three, everything happens for a reason. And that may sound nice at first. Really, oh, what a wonderful idea. That's nice. But actually, I think there may be nothing more offensive than that. For his suffering and sorrow is soon revealed to us. If everything happens for a reason, well, it's definitely not our reason. Because it's not what I would have chosen.